Okay, so in this tutorial, we're going to help out Christian a little bit, and in the process, maybe teach you guys a thing or two about Photoshop. So Christian's got this problem, right, where he's spent a little time casting all of these water bottles in concrete, and he's lost a handful of them. They're shut up in school, and now he's at home trying to reproduce a few. And so his original idea, right, would be to use these bottles in their actual size and their actual concrete weight, and have sort of these three-dimensional objects as barriers or obstacles in your day-to-day life. And I still think that there's some really great potential photography work that can happen in there. But in the vein of, say, for example, the artist and activist Nick Lampert, maybe we can do some things using image craft to sort of maybe make some suggestions or almost even proposals with the water bottles. And for example, maybe riffing on the contemporary photo surrealist, or what he says, magical realism of Erik Johansen, to sort of use the sort of truthiness or truthishness of photography to try to do some things with his work with the bottles and these photographs of traffic jams to sort of exaggerate these things as barriers or obstacles. So we'll walk through this process. Basically, what I had him send to me was a photograph of one of his bottles that he cast in concrete and lit against a white background, and a photograph of one of these traffic jams that he's interested in. We'll come back to these images in a second and talk about what's good about them and maybe what's not so good about them. And then I kind of want to start off this intro by just kind of piecing apart the Photoshop layers here. So, starting with just the raw image of this traffic jam, we had to plop in the photograph of his water bottle, right? And in a kind of by any means necessary, just kind of quick suggestion, this could potentially work, right? Like just kind of dropping in almost like a scissors and paper cutout. Now, if you want to push this to the next level, then we got to start talking about matching lighting spaces and this water bottle was photographed in a studio where all these cars were photographed in daylight. And so the idea of laying in a shadow, hand painting that in, and relighting the actual bottle itself using some shadows so that it matches the light space of the cars. And then possibly even adding in some photo defects like photographic noise to the bottle itself in order to try to sell the illusion. So how do we do all this? Let's back this all the way up to our two photographs here of the traffic jam and the water bottle. The first thing I would say is that if you're going to pull images from the internet like this one, you probably want to make sure that you're pulling images that are a reasonably large size. This one is, true to internet images, is 72 dpi, but at least it's got a fairly large physical footprint, 40 inches by 30 inches or so. If you end up pulling images from the internet and they're really, really small, you're going to spend all this time editing only to end up having a pretty small piece of artwork. When it comes to actually photographing your objects, then make sure that you're carefully considering the sort of lighting space and perspective of the photograph that you're going to be plopping it in. If my whole point here is to replace this traffic jammed bus with my bottle, it might make sense to kind of consider where's the light source in this photograph. If I want the bottle to be laying down sideways, there's a shadow on the ground underneath it. The way that this was photographed, the shadows are actually behind the bottle, so we're going to end up doing a whole lot more digital painting just to recreate it. If you get it correct photographically in the first place, you can really rely on some of that photographic work instead of having to paint it in. This one has also been photographed in the studio with a flash, and so a few things like maybe the white balance will be wrong, and just kind of a couple of hiccups that will just make more work in the future. But when it comes down to actually kind of cutting this out and pasting and dropping it in, we'll do a couple of steps here in Photoshop. The first thing would be, let's get this bottle cut out. Your quick select tool, which is hiding over here in your toolbar. If you click and hold keyboard shortcut W, will take you right there. The quick select tool behaves a little bit like a brush. I'm going to increase or decrease the size of that brush by tapping brackets and braces on the keyboard. And with my add to selection option here, I'll just kind of quickly drag over the water bottle, and that should give me a pretty quick selection of the outside edges. Now, there are some areas of this bottle that may need to be refined. So if I zoom in, Command plus, and I look at sort of the top of this water bottle here, I kind of want to get some of that broken concrete. So I'll shrink the brush, brackets and braces, kind of shrink that brush down and add to the selection. Now, it's totally possible that when you're adding to the selection, you'll get too much. So using the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC, you can then remove from the selection. Refining your selection in this way will just kind of get a cleaner and cleaner and cleaner edit. It takes a bit of time, so be patient with it. And the edge of this selection will eventually kind of come in right along where the bottle is. Again, the sort of better photographs you take, the less work this is here. But I'm just going to work with what Christian gave me to kind of make it a real life example. So refining the edge, I'll kind of scroll all the way down the bottle here and make sure I'm not accidentally selecting on too much material. I don't want to accidentally get, part of the paper background or something. I just want the concrete. And this selection is looking pretty good, so I'll Command minus, zoom back out, and I'll just start with a hard edge selection. Command C, Command V. We'll copy paste that into a new layer. So if I turn off the background layer, now you can see that I have my water bottle sort of perfectly cut out. The edges of this water bottle selection are going to be pretty hard, so that may kind of present a little bit of a problem later on, but for now, we're just going to go with that. I'm going to click on the tab up here in Photoshop now and just sort of pull that straight down. Now that I'm floating this file, I can do something that's kind of funky. I can use my Move tool, keyboard shortcut V, or it's this kind of arrow up here on top, and just drag and drop from one photographic file, from one Photoshop file into the other. From here, I need to zoom out because I've got some differences in size, right? Some kind of funky sizes going on, and I also want to rotate that bottle. If you can't see this blue bounding box around the outside of your object, come up here to your options bar and click Show Transform Controls. From here, I can hover over the corner and do things like rotate the bottle into position. I can scale it to make sure that it's, roughly the right size. As you're scaling it, it should just kind of automatically scale to fit. If you hold Shift now in the most recent versions of Photoshop, it allows you to distort the image. If you let go of Shift, it allows you to scale that without distorting. Now, in previous versions of Photoshop, that was reversed. So whichever technique you use, make sure that you're not messing with the sort of distortion of that bottle. So in here, I sort of want it to more or less fit into the photograph in exactly the same way that the bus did. Now you'll notice right here, I'm kind of covering up a part of this black car. That's okay. I'll fix that here in a second. But I mostly just want to hide the entire bus. And, I could maybe take advantage of a little bit of that bus's shadow, but for the most part, I need to completely block that thing out as I'm scaling. Once I've done that scaling and kind of what Photoshop calls transforming, I'll double click and accept those transformations. You'll notice that right up here there was a little checkbox. I could also click the check mark up there. Until I accept those transformations, Photoshop won't let me do anything else. The next thing I want to work on, I'm going to zoom in here, Command +++, is to sort of snip out the front hood of this car so that it actually kind of gets tucked behind the edge of the bottle. In order to do that, I'm going to use a layer mask hiding down here at the bottom of my layers palette. I'll click Add Layer Mask, and I'll get this white box right here. If you don't have your layer palette open, go to Window, Layers. Now, inside the layer mask, I've got somewhat of a strange solution to sort of snipping out the front hood of the car here, but it's a really powerful tool in Photoshop. If I grab my brush tool, keyboard shortcut B, and shrink the brush size down using the brackets and braces keyboard shortcut, I'm going to paint in black and white. So in the bottom of my toolbar here, I have the option to switch back and forth between black and white. I can either make those adjustments by clicking this little switch arrow key, or the keyboard shortcut to switch is X. If I paint in black inside the layer mask itself, it'll end up cutting holes through the photographic layer. If I switch to white now by using the keyboard shortcut X, white will repair that photograph. Right now I'm using 100% opacity here, so my cuts and repairs work with 100% clarity. If I have a hard-edged brush, I'm going to go to my brush options here in the upper left-hand corner, switch to a hard round. My cut lines have a really harsh or sharp edge. If I use the soft round, it's a little bit easier to sort of blend those photo edits in. Now here's what I'm going to do first. I'm just going to kind of block in really big, zoom in more closely, and shrink the brush. And now I'll switch back to a white brush, and just using 100% opacity, I'm just going to kind of slowly bring that edge closer and closer and closer to the hood of the car, going back and forth between the white brush and the black brush in order to kind of cleanly snip the hood of the car right out of the water bottle. Now, if I was really working here to try to sell the illusion, I might even take the green reflection out of the hood of the car, but that's a level of work I'm not quite ready to go for. That's probably good enough for this image. So if you notice, if I flip the kind of bottle on and off, or if I disable the layer mask, you notice how the bottle was just covering up a bit of the hood of that car. In order to sell the illusion, I needed to be able to see that. Now, if there were a lot more cars here, that could be a lot more work, but that looks like the only one I've got. The next step would be to address the sort of strangeness in the color here. Because this bottle was photographed in a studio with side lighting, it doesn't really have the right light space, and it's not casting a shadow in the photograph the way it should be. So let's add a brand new layer. Go to the Layers palette, and I'm going to stick that layer in between the bottle and the background. With the brush tool here, I'm going to add some shadow underneath the bus. Now, instead of using a layer mask, I'm just going to brush directly into this layer, so all of the brushing you do will sort of accumulate pretty quickly. I'm going to start with a larger brush and work towards a smaller one. This is really not photoshopping or photo editing so much as it's sort of like digital painting. As long as I kind of consider this, I'm trying to lay in a shadow similar to how I might shade a drawing. If I was working on a drawing of this water bottle, that's really what we're working on here. So, the closer that bottle is to the ground, the darker the shadow. I don't really want my shadow to get so intense that it looks too artificial, but right near the edge of the water bottle and the concrete should be nice and dark, and then it should fade out along the edges. That's good enough for now. The other thing that I'm going to have to do is actually rebuild some shading on the water bottle itself. And for that, I'll add another layer, and this time I'm going to use the assistance of a selection. So I can use selections not only to cut out things like the water bottle, but if I select my water bottle layer again, use my quick select tool, I'm going to expand my brush here and just do a real quick snap of the edge. And because that's the only thing in this layer, it automatically snapped right to the bottle. Now when I do my brush work, it'll only allow me to do that work inside of the selection. Let me demonstrate. The lower half of this bottle should really be thrown into shadow because all the lighting on these cars is coming down from above. And so I'm going to just kind of lay in a really quick shadow along the lower half of that bottle. And you notice how it's not affecting the concrete. Well, that's because my selection is sort of creating a boundary for where I can and can't paint. This is a really handy way to just kind of go in and do some rough value building. So the lower half of the neck here needs a bit of shadow. Oop, too much. Command Z. Command Z is going to be a really handy tool, kind of going back and forth and back and forth. So the closer that bottle gets to the ground, the darker that shadow should probably be. And I'll probably duck my opacity again here just to be able to work in lighter and lighter effects. In Photoshop, when you're working in lower opacities, they're cumulative, which means all of the successive brushstrokes are working towards maybe like 100%. So if I just lay down, one 14% layer and another 14% layer, it's a really nice way to sort of feather in those edits. So because I kind of need to rebuild the lightscape of this bottle, everywhere where there should be a shadow sort of casting as if it was lit from above needs to be darkened a little bit. This takes more of like a little bit of drawing skill than photography skill, but with a little bit of play, you should be able to figure it out. So now this layer 4 is really just an attempt to sort of relight the bottle. Command D, deselect. Now in this same layer, I may actually need to lay a highlight on top of the bottle, or I could add the highlights in another layer. So I'll come in, add a third layer for the highlight on top of the bottle, reselect the bottle so that I only apply highlights to the bottle itself. Remember, if I'm selected in this layer, my quick select tool just snaps right to its edges because it's just a floating bottle in space here. Go back to my brush, and this time I'm going to work with white, and I'm just going to lay in sort of a light highlight across the top of the bottle. Because everything else in this photograph is lit from above, it's pretty important that the water bottle also appears to be lit from above, and its highlights kind of are repositioned. This is a bit of a tricky skill to master, but essentially we've had to completely rebuild the lightscape. That's the way it came photographed from Christian's studio, and I've relit it now so that it looks more like it fits into the scene. a couple of goofy things are going on down here at the bottom of the water bottle. I see this kind of white line right where the bottle meets the concrete. I'm going to have to eliminate that. So I think I'll probably come in and attempt to sort of shade right along that bottom edge one more time. So I'll switch to the black brush, maybe use something like 25% opacity, and just sort of build more shadows there. And essentially, I probably shouldn't see much of a line down there at all. It should really just sort of disappear into space. And the hood of the car, right, it shouldn't be quite so reflective. It's, there's probably too much highlight there. The larger the brush you use, the less specific you really have to get with the brush. But that shadow's starting to get pretty intense. I'm going to back that off. So the shadows underneath the bottle now present it as though it was, illuminated from the sun above. The last thing I might do to kind of keep pushing this forward is to try to match the photographic defect. Now, for that, I'm going to have to get in really, really close and look at some of this photographic content on the cars itself. Since this was just kind of randomly pulled from the internet, I'm looking at the hood of the car here, and I'm seeing a lot of red and green speckling. Now, in the world of photography, that's called digital noise, and even though it's really subtle, it makes the difference between, this bottle, which was photographed, up close, and these cars, which were kind of photographed from far away and then pulled from the internet. It makes the two of those look really different. The water bottle doesn't have as much digital noise. It was also photographed using a smartphone, and that has a slightly different shaped pixel than whatever this cars are photographed with. The pixel structure looks a bit different. And so actually adding some photographic defects, like a little bit of noise, can help. To do that, I'm going to do a Command J here and duplicate my background layer. Go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise. And in here, as long as I can easily find the bottle, because it looks like I'm sort of way off. Here we go. I can get a little closer. You'll notice that as I increase the amount of noise that's being added, right, it totally dissolves the bottle. But if I add just enough to make it look like it was, photographed with a low-quality camera or posted online, it might actually start to feel a little bit more crunchy and have that digital texture, so that it feels a little bit like a photograph that wasn't edited quite so heavily. So if you were trying to go for a sense of like photorealism, that's the amount of work that would go into it, right? Slowly building those shadows underneath and reconstructing it. I'm excited to see what Christian does with this, and what you guys might also do, kind of playing with this idea of sort of photorealistic, surrealist images.